raises the visibility, that realizes that there are impacts to water quality when we look at some of the urban areas. So those are the three lessons that I think we take away from the flood. You'll likely see us bringing some pieces of this. We brought some of it to the Ag and Environment Task Force, Flood Task Force. We'll probably have something ready for the legislature this next year, but some kind of cost share programs around topping up some of our practices out there, considering the hydrology. And this is no small task. Remember, we started soil erosion practices out there from the 1930s when we had erosion problems. We added water quality to it. They work very well together, because anytime you stop soil erosion, you're benefiting water quality. But you add hydrology, and this is a different animal. It's not just how water moves, it's when it moves. It's how do you design this. You got to still get it off so the crop doesn't drown out, but you got to slow it down so you prevent the surge. This is not going to be a piece of cake, but it's something that certainly after this storm, I think we know we need to do, and we would expect there's going to be future events, and we don't want to sit around here, the next 4 times and say, I wish it wouldn't have happened. We got to be doing something about it, and it's not going to fix everything, but we got to be making progress. So that hydrology, the maintenance issue, and then urban conservation. And then a totally, certainly related, but additional area as well. I think from my experience, and Levon actually grew up in Dickinson County as well, from our experience of watching Dickinson County, watching what's happening down here, I think it's also time for a farmland protection program. It's something that we've been interested in up there. There was nothing available statewide. And it's not a piece of cake to put together either. You got to figure out who holds the easement, how do you create priorities, can you find the dollars? But I think now is the right time for several reasons. Obviously, before would have been a better time, but now is a better time in the future. But several reasons. One is you can absolutely make the case we need every acre in agriculture that we can have. We are also seeing, certainly with all the issues around economics, that in some ways, maybe some of that development, we could argue that we don't need necessarily all the development we thought we had to have 2 or 3 years ago. We have a new program that just passed the legislature this last year, a state cost share or state tax credit that is available if you donate land or some portion. In this case, it would be property right, a development property right, to an entity. You can get a state tax credit for 50% of the value. So the way that would work is let's say you had 40 acres of land that was worth $6,000 an acre as farmland. It's worth $16,000 an acre as development land. You have $10,000 an acre there that is of value, that development value. You could buy down that development value, and you get the first 100,000 of that. That can be a state tax credit that you need to take over a number of years, and so that increases that value. There's some federal tax deductibility. There is a federal farmland protection program, which Iowa has not participated in, which we need to be able to participate in, and we may be able to use some of these dollars as match. I would think it would make some sense generally to find some local dollars as well, some commitment from the local community to be a part of it. For piecing these pieces together, I think we can build a protection program. It's voluntary, it's not mandatory, but it's voluntary for folks that are in an area where development's coming, and they're needing some of those dollars, but they don't want to give up that farm forever. I'll tell you, one of the very best days as Secretary of Ag is the Century Farm and Heritage Farm Awards days at the State Fair, and we had those Tuesday and Thursday this last week. We had 358 farms in the state that were Century Farm award winners. We had families there with 40 or 50 people up on stage. We had to back our photographer up to be able to get everybody in the picture. These are in one of those cases. One of the ladies was in a wheelchair. She was she was in their 90s, and she said, "I have 4 generations of my family here, and I've been waiting 25 years for this day." She needs to be able to have the ability, if she's in an area that development's coming, that she can say, I want this to stay as a farm, and I want this to stay as a farm forever. I'm going to not allow development on this farm forever, but I'm going to be able to get some of that development income to be able to make sure that this farm stays viable. And I think in some cases, certainly as other development happens around it, there will be direct marketing opportunities and other kinds of opportunities there as well to keep that farm viable. But right now, the only choice often that you have is sell for the big dollars and lose that farm forever, or try and hold on to that farm in what has been really many years of tough times on the farms, especially if you get boxed in and it's hard to be able to grow, or you start to lose your farm to other development. You now then have a shrinking farm that makes it very hard to keep the remaining parts that you own economical. And so Irv and Levon were in the office within the last month or so as we talked about coming here, and we talked about this possibility, and we're looking forward to getting a group together, a work group together, to talk about what this needs to look like. How do we make sure and qualify for this? How do we package this in a way? How do we get the word out? How do we raise some of these dollars? Who would hold the easements? Those kinds of pieces. But I think it's certainly time, if it's not past time, for something like this. And I'm committed to work with you to be able to make that happen. So again, I'd love to take any questions, but appreciate the chance to be with you here today. Explain the necessity for, say that again?
Can you explain the necessity for putting hog manure from CAFOs on land that's being raised when soybeans growing on, or as soybeans growing on?
Yeah, there's, I guess the concern has always been is, does that create a problem or not, putting it on that soybean ground? And should that land be restricted from any kind of manure applications? And it's not just CAFOs, it's any kind of manure applications, including small farm applications. And generally, often actually, big farmers have more opportunity to be able to move that around sometimes than small farmers, depending on what your rotation is. And so the concern is, does that create a problem or not? And I guess many in the ag community have not seen that that is a problem by putting manure on soybean ground. You'll see most of the time that manure will go on ground that's going to corn because you want the nitrogen value. And what happens is, if you put it on ground that's going to soybeans, that soybean does use that nitrogen. It doesn't fix its own. It's not the most efficient way to produce soybeans or to use that nitrogen, especially as nitrogen has gotten a lot more valuable. So you see folks being a lot more careful with it now. But sometimes you end up with issues where you can't get to a cornfield to apply it. You have, I know certainly the other issue that's out there is on frozen ground. Should it be applied to frozen ground? And we know we got great problems if you apply manure to frozen ground. The folks that really run into the problem are sometimes the smaller producers, especially small dairy producers, northeast Iowa, got to move that manure all winter long. And you've got to have a place for that. And they are not set up with permanent storage to hold that manure. So I don't know that it's necessary. It's important to be able to have that option. You're not going to see very much of it go on ground that's going to be soybeans, especially now when fertilizer is so expensive. In the last 2 years, it has nearly tripled in value. So you're not going to see that go on many areas of that soybeans, but I think it's beneficial to be able to have that until we find out that it creates a problem. Okay, please.
What needs to be done to reduce the amount of nutrients going into the rivers and create dead zones in the ocean?
Yeah, there's a real concern about that, and should be. There's one of the things that was done, actually started before I was at the Department of Agriculture, is called a CREP program. We've ramped it up as well, and a CREP program, CREP, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, is a program that each state has and designs to work with the federal government. The federal government covers a larger percentage of the cost. And what this program for Iowa does, and it's unlike any others out there, is it creates wetlands. Generally, where we're seeing our nitrogen get into our streams is it's coming through the tile lines. Surface water is not carrying much nitrogen, but tile line water is. And it's carrying it for various reasons. Sometimes because of a lot of fertilizer in that area, but often just because we have very high organic matter soils. You don't fertilize a field. You take the tile water that comes out from under that field, and you're likely to see high nitrogen rates within that water. So what this CREP program does is it surfaces that tile water, puts it into a wetland, and a wetland that maybe is just 2% of what the watershed is that comes into that area. And if you retain that water within that wetland, you're able to denitrify that water. Basically, the nitrogen leaves as nitrogen gas, not methane, but as nitrogen gas into, and you're able to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in that water anywhere between 60 and 90%, depending on how much water is moving through there. The problem is it's very expensive to do. You got to build a wetland. You can't do this everywhere. You don't have enough fall. The tile lines under these fields, if there's tile out there, are maybe 3 or 4 feet deep, and you have enough fall that someplace else that's above the surface of the ground, and you've got to surface that water. So this doesn't work everywhere, but this has worked very well in that. Now, we've looked as well with what would it take. In fact, we took the whole Cedar River watershed and said, what would it take in that watershed to reduce the amount of nitrogen leaving that watershed by 40% and reduce the amount of phosphorus leaving by 30%. It's going to take cover crops. It's going to take some reduced nitrogen rates, certainly some split nitrogen, where you're not applying most of it in the fall. Most of it's either applied in the spring or later in the season, side dressing time. It's going to take some CREP projects where those work as well, and I wish I remember the amount of dollars that it took to actually do that. It's technically possible, but it's hard to do. Really what has happened to some extent over time is we've taken some of our pasture ground, the ground where we had permanent vegetation, and we've taken that ground where that vegetation would soak up that nitrogen. There's no crop there in the spring. We've tiled it, so we've added tiles out there, and we've created more water coming off of our fields that are going through tile lines. And unless we change back to vegetation, it's tough to do. There are pieces of this that can do those things and can reduce that amount. It's not inexpensive. We haven't figured out all cover crops in all the kinds of places to make it work, but we can do some of those things, and we're starting. We're just barely starting. CREP is one of those, I think, good ways to be able to show farmers things can be done, but we've got a long ways to go. Please.
Along that line, shouldn't we then absolutely forbid the destruction of any other wetlands in this state?
Forbid destruction? Well, I mean, I would generally a farm program, as far as putting in the farm ground, if it's a designated wetland, you're not able to drain that and participate in the farm program at all. Now,
I'm speaking more generally of
urban areas.
Urban and transportation projects that have targeted these areas time and time again.
In some cases, it seems like almost they go for those areas because those are low value areas. Yeah, I think we have to raise the level of understanding. I don't know how that's done, John, for sure, but I think it certainly makes sense that we have to value our wetlands more and understand their role. I mean, to us, some of this about building wetlands again in some of those areas helps. I think urban conservation has a potential to help as we create some rain gardens and some wetlands in some of these areas. As part of the idea behind urban conservation is not just that we absolutely need it, which we do, because of the water quality concerns, but it's also raising the understanding of how do we manage water and what are the impacts to water quality out there. And there are folks that say this is everybody else's problem but mine. I don't have anything to do with this. And to me, when you go to a homeowner and you say you got 3 foot of water coming every year on your roof and on your lawn, and what are you doing to protect that? And that includes state property too. I mean, I was actually walked out my apartment in downtown Des Moines today, and there was those little white BBs. Somebody had fertilized the grass along there, and there were about 3 feet of it out in the street. And you know where that's going? That's not getting picked up, and the plants can't use that. That's going to the Des Moines River, which is a block and a half away. And we've got to raise some of that understanding, because people should be yelling and screaming about that and say, don't you dare do that in my neighborhood. And Right now, there's not a sense of that at all yet, and I think we have a long ways to go.